Good morning, I'm WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome to the first episode of Cain, Freedom City. Landon Welch looked about the empty space of his new studio. The duffel bag of all of his worldly possessions next to his feet. And he wanted to cry again. He was 18 years old and had just moved to Freedom City. There was nothing in the small room other than basic kitchen things shoved off in one corner, and a bathroom with a toilet he was told that worked, a shower that also supposedly worked, and a sink that clearly had a small leak. But all of those were in what almost constituted a second room, so there was that. His life was so different now than just a few months ago. A few months ago, he was a star defensive lineman for the Midvale High School Serpents. He had always been good at football, but when he was offered a one-time non-detectable serum, he was more than good. He was the best. He could throw down against any guy put up against him and sack the opposing quarterback in seconds. Nobody had an answer for him. He could go anywhere he wanted for college. In a couple of years, he would draft into the NFL, probably at a very high draft pick for a defensive lineman. But that was all over now. Now he was in a shitty one-room apartment in a shitty area of Freedom City, and he was about to start a job tomorrow at some warehouse in a place called Green Bank. No one looked at him the same anymore in his hometown. At least here in Freedom, no one would know who he was or what he had done. He supposed that that was why this city was called Freedom. He certainly had freedom now. Freedom in anonymity. It was too late, and he was too broke to do anything like buy a mattress or a bed or a chair or anything tonight. So he put his jacket against one of the walls and leaned against it, pulling out his Android and going to YouTube to watch some videos before going to bed. That night was one of the worst nights of his life. He used a couple of his clean t-shirts as a pillow and his jacket as a blanket and slept on the floor in one corner of his apartment. Long before the night was over, he knew he needed a mattress and a set of blinds. He managed to doze a bit from time to time, but mostly he laid there in one of the several pools of light from all of the light that came through his window, listening to the sirens of the Freedom City Police Department, the Freedom City Fire Department, and whoever it was who owned and operated the ambulances. The next morning, Landon got up, took a shower, only to discover that his new shower only had about 4.5 minutes of warm water. Once dressed, he left his apartment and picked up a small breakfast to eat on the way to his new job. He caught a bus a block from his apartment. He had studied the transit routes between his apartment and the job as soon as he knew he was going to have both. The ride here was long enough that he had had plenty of time. Most of the city was behind him on the trip out to the warehouse, but off to one side was the South River and South Side, while the suburbs were on the other side of the road. He tried as hard as he could not to do the tourist thing of looking at how tall all the buildings were. He knew that no Fredonian would do something like that. He peeked a couple of times. He couldn't help it. He was not used to buildings like this. He was a small-town boy from Kansas. He had never been to a city before. Well, at least not a city like Freedom or New York or, hell, even Chicago. Now here he was, a couple months out of high school, living in a city of almost 4 million people. Everything should feel new and amazing to him. And it kind of did. But last night sucked a large chunk of the magic out of the city for him. All of the pictures he had seen of the studio had it furnished, so it never occurred to him that maybe it wouldn't be fully furnished. And after depositing first and last month's rent, as well as a security deposit, he had almost no money to his name. That was a big part of why he was taking this job at a warehouse in a part of town even sketchier than the one he lived in. It paid in cash at the end of every day. He was shaken out of his thoughts when he noticed the name of the street they were passing. His stop was coming up. He pulled the cord that went the entire length of each side of the bus to indicate a stop was requested. He got out in a dingy stop that no one else got off at. It was almost a quarter of a mile from the bus stop to the warehouse he was working at, but there was no closer stop, and there was no way in hell he could afford a vehicle or even a taxi to take him out here. So, he walked for a quarter of a mile in the pre-dawn and reached the warehouse with some time to spare. Landon noted how long the trip took and went to find the supervisor so he could begin his training. He was done with the office side of training within 2 hours and was on the floor to learn what they were doing. Loading and unloading semi-trucks. A person on a forklift would take a pallet off the back of the truck, and one of the people standing nearby with a pallet jack would take the pallet and put it wherever it was needed, and when they were loading it, they would do that process in reverse. It was as mind-numbing as it was back-breaking. And after 8 hours of working a pallet jack, he started his quarter of a mile walk with less money than he had hoped in his pocket. He ended up at a department store a few blocks from his apartment and bought a mattress. He had to pay extra to have it delivered because once he was there to buy it, he realized he didn't have any way to bring it home by himself. Then he had to pay even more extra to make sure it was delivered that night. All told, he only had enough money left to buy some cheap noodles by the time he had finished with the mattress. But he had a mattress, a pillow, and a sheet set with a comforter. He spent his second night alone in his small studio apartment, eating noodles, in bed, watching videos on his phone. When he went to bed that night, he slept like the dead. His first week went like his second day in the city. He would wake up early in the morning and take a bus out to the warehouse and work for 10 hours before taking a bus back into the city with some money in his pocket, and he would buy something that he needed for the apartment. By the end of the week, he had blinds, a table, with a chair, as well as a basic dining set for one. He had noticed some clear drug users that hung out near his apartment building, but they apparently did not want to mess with a guy who was almost 7 feet tall and clearly ripped. What he kept to himself was that he could carry 38 tons. He had to be very careful at work not to break the pallet jacks by pulling them too hard. It was why he was so good at football his last season. He could push the heaviest guy they'd put against him aside with minimal effort. His first weekend in Freedom City was a time to pursue the reason he had come to Freedom in the first place. He took a bus down to the public library and went to the newspaper archives. He was looking for anything and everything he could find on Grant Co., a biotech firm based here in Freedom, that he was sure was behind the serum that had given him the huge power he had. It was one thing that he had gotten extreme power and had trouble keeping it in check. It was another when it killed the entire rest of the football team, including his little brother. And everybody in town knew that they were trying to get the results he got from this serum. Not only was he a survivor, but he was the first person who had taken it. And the guy who had given it to him used his success to promote it through town. The asshole claimed that he had gotten it from it falling off the back of a truck that was stopping at Amalthea Incorporated headquarters. His story had changed when he felt the ligaments in his shoulders starting to tear. Landon had spent the next 2 months tracking down everything he could about the company the guy had named as the company who sold it to him. It was hard to trace, but Landon had eventually figured out that it was a subsidiary of Grant Conglomerates, and he knew he'd need to move to Freedom City. Not that moving away from Midvale was a bad idea, with everyone in town blaming him for the death of a large chunk of the teenage men in town, especially since it was the football team. Some nights he wondered if it had been the basketball team, if the town would have let him off easier. Then again, if it had been basketball, he wouldn't have dedicated every moment he could remember for as far back as he could remember trying to master his sport. As he was flipping through some of the recent newspapers, he kept seeing mentions of some guy being called the Pugilist, and it happened enough times that he'd make sure to make a note to look up that guy later. At the end of the day, he was back in his apartment tallying up what he knew about Grant Conglomerates. It was a multinational holding company overseeing a number of high-tech interests. The biotech part he had been focusing on was apparently only a tiny part of the company, which was new to him. The company was about 30 years old, having been founded in the early 1980s. There were a lot of drug treatments and gene splicing and cybernetics going on with a couple of the divisions. Apparently, it was an outgrowth of the former goal of the company to improve on the human experience, whatever that bullshit meant. The head of the company was a man named Jonathan Grant, who was in his 40s and dressed as if he was in his late 20s. Everything about him seemed to be full of shit. Not that there was anything Landon could do about that. At least, not yet. He put away the folder that he had started on Grant Co. and went back to his bed and got comfortable. Pulling out his phone, he decided to look up this pugilist guy. There's only one video on YouTube about him, but it was amazing. He was surrounded by 7 guys with pipes, and not only did he hold his own, but he won that fight. Looking deeper, it seemed like this man was trying to clean up the streets of Freedom City, attacking both gang members and drug dealers. That was something Landon could get behind. He didn't have the training that people in forums speculated that the pugilist must have, but when you can literally hit like a freight train, Landon didn't think you really needed that much in the way of training. Just one hit and they were out. That was how he was going to start working his way toward Grant Co. He would conceal his identity and start biting around the edges of the criminal underworld here in Freedom. Hell, maybe he'd get lucky and find an in to Grant Co. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of Cain. Make sure you tune in tomorrow for another new series. One of the last new series for a while. There'll be one more a week from tomorrow, but tune in. Thank you.